It's today's session. We will first talk about what is data visualization, and next up, I will try to present to you the basic of D3.js. My main goal for today is to show you how to, is not to show you how to build a complete dashboard, which is what a Magfix build event would be more suitable for. Maybe you can run that event next sem if Sai agrees to it. This session, I would just like to introduce you to the D3.js framework and the grammar, which can help you understand the basics. And there are many resources online similar to other languages, showing you how to do fancy plots and graphs. But without the basics, all the code will probably look like gibberish to you. So my main goal for today is that you will be able to search online for more advanced code and understand what's going on after the session. And then you can build yourself a super complex visualization. So first of all, what is data visualization? It is essentially the process of conveying any type of data using a visual medium. So I just like to show you some example. Visual Cinnamon is my favorite blogger about this. She's what I would call a data artist. So all of these artworks here are made using data. I'll just show you one. So these are basically data collected to talk about trees and how they grow. And for more traditional data visualization, there's also like these type of data where it's more clear what is going on and less artwork. And yeah, so basically, whatever type of information you're trying to convey, and if you try to do it visually, it's considered data viz. Back to the slides. So why do you need data visualization? I'm guessing most of us here are doing anything related to tech, or at least related to coding. So I would say, personally, I would define two main use cases for data viz. The first use case is data exploration and doing data analytics. It is very common to use for data analytics, use out-the-box tools to generate quick plots, just like Word. That just basically works, like Excel and Tableau. For more advanced user, you can even use R or Python. If you're a data analyst, data scientist, data engineer, this is what you will mostly be working with. Why are you using these tools then? That's because you want to spend most of your time trying to understand what's going on inside the data. What does it mean, and what is it trying to tell you? What if you're a software developer, though? You might not necessarily be involved in the data exploration phase, but nowadays, usually everything has to do with data. So if you're a web designer or a front-end developer, maybe sometime in the future, you need to be involved in data communication and presentation. For a website, that may be something like showing user traffic or interactions, or maybe if you're making a weather app and trying to show weather data in some form. So D3.js is usually used for this case, since that's what you spend majority of the time making it look presentable, easy to understand, and also create a narrative. Sometimes people will try to incorporate a story into the data viz to make it more relatable to the reader. Those are more for newspapers or magazines visualizations. And you use D3 in this case and not in the exploration case because you will spend a lot of time just debugging. and you do not want to spend a lot of time debugging when you're just trying to do analysis. Again, these two cases are not really mutually exclusive, and often are intertwined. You would just go from one case for another, or like do both at the same time. Learn from experience, sadly. So in academia, the field of research regarding this area is called data viz and visual analytics, which discusses many aspects on how to present data visually. Monash and almost every university has units and laboratories dedicated to this area. So if you're interested in more of the design theory behind it, people usually discuss color theory, design theory, user experience, and they introduce new types of plots, etc. You can look into reading about this. So why did I choose D3 for this session? Well, it's basically for presentation purposes. We as software developer, and especially when you're trying to convey information, you want it to be as accessible as possible. And what is the most accessible platform right now? It's basically the web. When it comes to universal, usually you think of data visualization as a static image. But nowadays, if you want to add interactivity, that's something that's kind of hard to do with only a JPEG. And that's where JavaScript and HTML come in. So you can basically do most of the stuff with Plotly or all the tools like R and Python, but there's no denying that JavaScript is just synonymous with universality. It basically runs on all consumer platforms. So here are some examples to what D3.js are used for. I'll just pick the one I want to show you. Just pick this one. Well, since we're already here. I don't know how to link it. Well, it's on this website. So if you go to Visual Cinema, I'll just pick up one of her her projects. So most of her projects are actually made using D3. As you can see, something like this, where she's trying to showing astronomical data for a newspaper. And all of these can be made with D3 and can be accessible on your phone as well, which I thought was pretty cool. So now it's for the more practical part of the session is for the coding time. So first, I think I'll show you what we are trying to accomplish today. So first, I'll try to introduce you to the basic of SVG and D3, and then we can create something like this, which is just a basic bar chart. And I don't know if time would allow it, but if we can, I can also show you how to do line plots with animations, and also a scatter plot. This is my own set of data that I'm working on at the moment. And you can see that we can add interactivity such as highlighting of tooltip and animations. But if time allows it. If not, then I'll still be able to cover most of the basic, and the code for all of these will be included in the GitHub that I will post at the end. And you can, if you're interested, you can take a look at how I did it. I added a lot of comments, so hopefully it makes sense to you. Okay, let's start with coding then. So first of all, I want to send this to the chat. So if you can take a look at this link, this is the documentation I'll use for today. It includes most of the code that we need to work on. But I'll do live coding and show you how to write everything from scratch. So this is just for your reference. If I'm going too fast, or if you want to look at it later on, you can use this page. Yeah, cool. And my tablet decides to update right now, which is fun. Okay, let's start coding, I guess. So first, I'll just show you what SVG is. So let's create basic HTML. Let's call this first HTML. So if you've seen an HTML page before, it basically includes a head element and a body element. And inside this body element, what we want to use is called an SVG tag. So an SVG tag is basically just a canvas. And SVG is like a shape. I like shapes. So it's the way that you draw on the browser. So instead of using images, you are trying to define your own shape. And so now I want to create a canvas that's about, that has the width of 400 and maybe height of 300. And then I want to add some color to it, I guess. Then we use the style tag and we fill it with, let's see, let's pick a nice color. Aquamarine seems nice. And let's save this. If you have VS Code and if you're using the live server extension, you can just click on Go Live to see the website. If not, you can just run this HTML file directly in your browser. Okay. Now, let's see. So it returns this, but nothing is going on. Let's see that. So you can see our SVG element here, but for some reason it's not being filled with the color. Let's check out. And okay, let's try. Okay, so what I've just added here is that instead of trying to fill the canvas, which what appears just then means that it doesn't work, we'll try to draw a rectangle then. And to draw a rectangle, what you basically do is add a rect element, and then you set the width and height of that rect. Rect basically stands for rectangle, and then you can add the fill argument before we try to do aquamarine, right? And then I want to add a stroke to it as well. The stroke is basically just an outline, and just for flares, I added the random ellipse. So an ellipse is basically what the name suggests is an ellipse. The CX and CY means the location of the center of the ellipse. So CX means the location is 100 on the x-axis and 80 on the y-axis. The Rx and Ry is basically the radius in each direction. If you set this to be equal, it's basically just a circle. But you can be more flexible and set them to be more of oval shape. Okay, now let's see what we got. So this is what we got from that code. And you can play around with this, but that's essentially how SVG elements work in HTML. But that's not very interesting. That's a very, I would say, caveman way to do it. So let's see how we can try and improve this and do it in a more elegant way. Okay, so first, we would want to load in D3.js. So how do we do that? Fortunately, it's very easy. You basically just add a script tag and add the address for the D3.js repo, which if you look in the notes, I've added the link for it. Yeah. So if you add this tag, when the browser loads the HTML file, it will automatically load this package. And we also want an SVG canvas. Okay, now we have a blank SVG canvas. Let's do some actual coding. You can create a separate JavaScript file if you prefer to do it that way. I just want to put it in a script tag inside this HTML page just for demonstration purposes, so I don't have to go through multiple files. First, we want to somehow get this SVG element, canvas element to use. So we just call a variable SVG canvas here. And the first function that we will be introduced to today is called D3.select. And with D3.select, you can basically add any name for any HTML element inside the HTML page. And it will return it as a JavaScript object. So because I want this SVG element here, I will just put SVG as the name for it. And the next function we will use is called attributes. And the SVG element, if you recall from before, I added width and height to it. So first we just set some width. I'll just say 960 is what I have in the example. And height is around 540. And just for the sake of clean code, I'll add a class to it as well, because I know web dev love their classes. Okay. Let's see what this did. So now if you reload the page, you can see in the inspector our SVG element, even though we declared it with nothing, the JavaScript code has been ran and it has set the attributes to be correct, to be of the correct size. It even has a class SVG canvas to it as well. Okay, now what can we do with this canvas? So what about the rectangle we had before? So how do we draw rectangles using D3? It's actually a much cleaner way to do it, in my opinion, which is basically, we call the SVG canvas element that we saw before, and we call a function called append. We are appending something to the canvas, and we want to append a rectangle, and the rectangle is called rect. And so for this case, I want the rectangle to be defined by using coordinates instead. So I want the rectangle to be at x of 100 and y of 100. Let's see. And I want it to have a width of 100 actual height. Okay, so okay, let's see. I want it to have a color as well. A color So color is basically fill. And you can specify some color here. You can just say red or blue, or you can use some RGB hex code. I'll just say light blue in this case, because I cannot recite RGB code on top of my head, from the top of my head. So now you can see we have this cute little rectangle here. That's in our code. And we did it with basically declarative code. We just define what we want the rectangle to look like using JavaScript. I will show you a couple of other basic SVG elements. So here is an ellipse from before. Well, okay. So I want to paste this on kind of thing. This is, I just copied it from the notes. I just realized from the notes I added Rx and Rys to a rectangle. You shouldn't do that. I don't think that exists. But yeah, you can see that there's an ellipse element, a circle element, and a line element. These are all the basic shapes that we want to add. There are also other shapes as well, but I haven't included here. You can just Google what shapes are available. And using this, let's see what happened. So now you can see that there are a bunch of random shapes here. I have a line, I have a circle, I have an ellipse, and I have a rectangle. So if you think about it, this is actually basically all you need to make a plot, to make a data visualization. This is all you need. But doing it this way isn't very efficient. So we don't want to manually decide where a rectangle will be or where a circle will be. We want it to be defined by our data set. So how do we load the data into our code? So first, I'll just delete all of this. Maybe I'll keep the canvas. D3 has a function called D3.csv, which the first parameter would be the data path, and the second parameter is a function. This function is basically what to do with the data. Once the D3.js library reads the data, it returns a JavaScript object containing that data, and it will pass to this function. So we need to somehow handle it. I'll just call the variable data, and then first thing we do, let's just try to print it out and see what the data looks like. So where is this data path? You can use your own CSV file as well if you have one, but I have prepared one for this example. And the path is included in the notes. If you can see, it's basically just this URL like here. Let's call 3data.csv. Okay. Let's try to see what happens in the console. Okay. So in the console, it shows. Remember that this function I just declared here, I did not call it anywhere. What D3 is doing, it's reading this data path and it's passing it through to the function for me. I don't have to do it myself. And so now what we have here is basically an object with three items. This represents 3 rows in the data, and each row has 2 columns. If you go to the raw website, too many windows. I have no idea where it went. Okay, here we go. So if you go to the raw website on the GitHub page. This is what the data looks like. It basically has 3 rows and 2 columns. This is what it's loading right now. You can use your local CSV file as well if you have one ready. Okay, let's see how we can use this to draw something. So first, we want to, let's say I want to draw some circles using this data. First thing first is remember, when you try to draw something, you append it to the canvas. So I use the SVG canvas element, and I call a function called select all circle. So this might seem unintuitive. Why am I selecting all circle when I have no circle existing at the moment? The way we do this is basically because it's for when you have no data or already have some data on the page and you want to update it, you always call select all. And then you pass in the HTML11 in here. And the select all function will return a list of all of those elements on the page. So right now, as we don't have any circle, we will just return an empty list, but that's fine because we're just starting out and we will try to append something to that list. The next function I would use is called data. And data basically takes in our data. And then, but it doesn't know what to do with it. We want to use the data inside of data object. And to do that, we call another function called enter. So if you to think about enter, it basically acts as a loop. So it basically goes through all the row inside of your data and returns an object. So it might sound a bit abstract at the moment, but let's see what it means right now. So as I mentioned before, enter gives us an object for each of the row. So now on each of the row, I want to add a circle to it. So I will just call append circle right behind enter. Remember, enter is like a loop, but it's just not specified here. It's like abstracted away, but you can think of it as a loop. So first, now we have a circle, and let's see. And then we want to place this circle somewhere. Let's just say I want it to be at, well, let's not be 0, 0, at x50 and y50. So for a circle, the position is basically cx, It stands for center x, center y. And we would also want some radius. Let's see what the circle looks like. Now we have a black circle here, but it's not using our data. And there's only one. I mentioned that the enter function was as a loop, but it's only showing one here because all 3 circles are on top of each other. So now we want to do this a smarter way. And just like before, D3.js has this pattern that it really likes to use, is that you always pass a function for it to do something on. So the syntax for it is basically you define a function as a second parameter. If you're new to JS, this might seem pretty weird because if you come from other languages, you might not be able to pass function directly like this. But in JavaScript, a function is an object, and you can basically pass an object via another object, which is another function. JavaScript is weird. I really find it strange sometimes. But the first element to this function is, I would just call it row, and the second is index. So what is this function doing? And what is row and what is index? Okay, so like every web developer, when you don't know what a JavaScript function does, just print it. And I just console.log, go, console.log. Also, because this is assigning something to the CX attribute, I'll just return a value. I just say 10. Okay, now as you can see, I have this function here that's printing row and index, and it's being printed 3 times. That's because, as I've mentioned before, the enter function here works as a loop. It will call everything afterwards for each row of the data. Okay, so now we can see that in this function called row gives us the first row, second row, and third row, and index is 0, 1, 2, and 3. That's pretty straightforward. And now, because we see that we have access to the data now we can use it to position our circles. I would like my circles to be positioned horizontally within the index. So let's say we use index and times 150. Now we can see that our circles are now separated. But the first circle is like on the edge here because it starts at 0. So I'll just add some offset to it. And now everything is nicely placed on the screen. Okay, so what else can we do with this? Our radius now is fixed, but I want the radius to be corresponding to the value of the data. So I would just do the same thing. I'll declare a function called row and index, and then I'll return something to it. And to access the data in the row, it's basically the same as accessing any JavaScript object. You just call the name of the object. You use a square bracket to index it, and you pass the name of the column you want. So I want the column value. What this is doing, it's basically assigning the row value to be the radius of the circle. Now we can see that the circle is sized according to the value from before, which is pretty neat. But then this is not very interesting. It's just 3 black circles. We can try to color it somehow using attribute fill, and then I'll just say blue for now. So now it's blue. But I wanted, if you have done any types of plots before, you don't want to specify the color for every single point, or like don't want to do it manually at least. You want to map it to a color scale. And the way we do this is we use a module from D3 called D3 Chromatic, I think. And you can find this in the notes. That's not the link you want. Notion is weird for me sometimes. Okay, let's see if I can type it out. It's called D3 scale chromatic, and I'll use version 1 and unified version of JS. Let's see if that loads. Okay, no errors. So I typed it correctly. So the steps to coloring the data is as follows. First thing you want to think about is how do you color data? Usually the first thing we have to think about is what is the domain of the color? Like what is the value that corresponding to a color? In our case, my column value is numerical, so my domain will be a numerical domain. So I want to define a domain, you find the max and min value of something, right? So let's just write a very basic max and min algorithm. There's a math function to do this, but I would just do it manually so that it's clear for everyone. I'll use a for each function. And then the for each function basically applies a function to each of the data points. So in a min-max algorithm, it's pretty basic. I'll just check the current value, which is the data point and the value column number. And then I'll just see if it's minimum, if it's smaller than the current min, and then I'll set it. Or if it's bigger than the current max, then we'll update it. So after this runs, you get the min and the max of your data, of the column of your data. And from this, you can define the domain for your column. So I'll create a variable called value to range. This is a scale linear object. So what is a scale object in D3? Scale object is basically something that you define a domain and a range for. And then afterwards, after you have defined it, you put in some value inside your domain. It will return a corresponding value in your range. So let's just see specifically what that means. So I want to declare my domain to be from min to max. My range can be from 0 to 1. Because in color, let's imagine your color scale having, it's like a smooth gradient, and 0 basically means the leftmost color and 1 means the rightmost color. So what this is doing here, it's trying to say if it's the minimum value in the data, assign it to the leftmost color. If it's a maximum value, assign it to the rightmost color. So now range to color is another object that we can. I just call something called interpolate blues. This is just a specific color scale that's readily available. You can check it out at d3scale.chromatic GitHub page. That basically gives you the list of all the available color scales that you have. Yeah, so what I'm using is interpolate blues, which is basically this right here. So now how do we use that scale in our function? So I want to fill it with the proper color. So I just pass row and index again. And then I'll return the range to, I'll use the range to color object, which is range color. And then value to range. And then we pass in our current value. Our current value is row value. Let's see what that did. Oops, data is not defined. Oh, that's weird. Oh, wait. Oh, I'm trying. I put this in the wrong place. My bad. So all of this shouldn't be outside of the CSV function. Because we want this to be in the scope of reading the file. So we have to declare it inside of here. That was totally my bad. If you put it outside, what we want is to basically put it inside the CSV block. And okay, now we see that we have the 3 properly colored circles, but this one is quite pale. It's almost invisible. So to shift, the reason for this is because if you look at the scale, it starts from white. And I don't want it to start from white. I want it to start from the middle. And how do we decide that in the code? Just to shift it, what I basically do is just shift the range to 0.5. Remember that scale linear, what it does, it maps the min value to the starting value of the range and the max value to end value. So this means that the min value is now beginning at the middle of the range instead. And now it should be, yeah, now it has a nice blue color to it. Okay, so now this isn't really clear what data these circles are representing. So maybe we should try adding some labels to it. So we do the same as adding circles. We want to start with select all, and now we want to add text. So I was just saying select all text, and then I'll just do the same thing again, find the data, enter the data attribute. So for the text attribute, oh, I forgot. I have to append the text first. Append the text object. And then for the attribute of text, the first one is the location of the text. So now, where do I want my label to be? I want my label to be somewhere around the data point. So the x value is basically row index. It's basically the same as the x value for the circle, I guess. Okay, copy and paste this. Oh, it should be an arrow. Yeah. Okay, so the y value, let's see. So my y value currently is 50. Let's say let's put it somewhere below 50. Let's put it at 100. This is just some CSS thing that I want the text anchor to be in the middle so that the text is not shifted to the left. You don't need to do this, but I just do it for aesthetics reason. Okay, so now to set the text, a text element has a method called text, which basically updates text. Here I can put whatever text I want. I want hello, and I'll see what happens. Now I see a bunch of hellos neatly below the circle. And if you notice something weird, is that even though the circle's at y50 and the text is at y100, the text is actually below the circle. This is because in computer graphics, the convention for screen space meaning coordinates on your screen, the y-axis starts upside down. So the origin 0, 0 is in the top left. So y increasing is going downwards, which is kind of weird if you're used to normal coordinate system. But that's just something we have to get used to. But we don't want all the text to be hello. We want it to be some information about the data. So we pass it. So we return the row let's say I want to show the title and then the value. Okay, now it clearly shows each point and what it means. A of 10, B of 10, and C of 30. Okay, now that's cool, but it's still a bit boring. We can do something more about it in your plots, maybe in one of my sample plots. You can see that there's something called highlighting. Highlighting basically means when you mouse over something, it highlights it in some way. The way I'm doing it here is basically I'm making all other elements transparent and keep the thing I'm hovering on opaque. So the way we do that is for each of the circle, we want to know when our mouse is over that circle. And we want, so in JavaScript, we want to add something called an event listener. To add an event listener, we have this, D3 has this convenient function called on. And what we want to know is on mouse over. This is the name of the event. It has to be mouse over, specifically mouse over for this case. And when the mouse is over this element, what happens? Well, just like all other D3 methods, we pass to it a function on what to do. So I want a function here, and let's also roll it in there. I want a function, and I want every single circle in the canvas to be transparent. So I use select all circle. Remember, select all returns every single element with that tag in the HTML file, and set their opacity to around maybe half, 0.5. Okay. So now when I mouse over everything, you can see that everything turned a little bit transparent, but it includes the point I'm on as well, which is what I do not want. So what we basically do is we call D3.select this. Now this is the important part. I mean this, not that this. This here basically represent the context. In JavaScript, this means the context the function is being called in. So when mouse over is activated, this represents the element that the function is called on. So this is selecting the function that the mouse is the element that the mouse is over, and I want it to not be transparent. So opacity is 1. Okay. Now, if I hover over this item here, everything else turns transparent, except for the one my mouse is over. But everything remains the same when my mouse leaves the point, which is also what we want. And that requires another event called mouse out. And mouse out works in the same way as everything else. We want to make every circle opacity of 1. Okay, so now this is what it looks like. It got a bit fancier, yeah. So with this, you can basically start creating a basic scatter plot already. You can use your own data and then assign some other variable to your cx and cy, and you get yourself a scatter plot. which is basically what I did here. I just added a lot more CSS styling to it, so it looks nicer, but the concept is the same. That's what I just showed you. Okay, next we want to make a proper chart. This is basically just a simple canvas, but I want to do something more serious. I want to do something that actually is a chart. So let's create our new file called, I'll just call it second. You can call it whatever you want. Second.html. I'll use what I have in here. And I don't need this code. Okay. I'll just reuse everything and load in all the same elements that I had before. And just for the sake of conventions, I know web developers, they love their divs. So we just create a divs here, and then I'll just put an ID called plot. If you're new to CSS and HTML, this is basically how you will find this specific div in your page later on using the ID tag. Because in a page you might have multiple divs. In our case, we only have one, but just for nice and clean coding convention, we use ID. Okay, so now we no longer have the SVG on. We want to select the ID of plot. Okay, so now how do we do that? In HTML and CSS, to mark something as an ID, you start with a hash. So if I do hash plot, this gives us the plot element. And then I can then set the width and the height. And just because of I've tried this before for spacing. This is just for spacing, but I've predefined some code for the margins of the site. You don't need this, but it just so that everything is positioned nicely. It's in the notes I've included, so you can reuse it. And okay, so when I've selected this plot, remember that before we append everything to an SVG element, but now we don't have a div element. What we want is to add our actually append our SVG element to the plot div. So we call that using SVG append SVG, and then we'll pass the width and the height. So I did all the math here already to calculate how big the SVG should be, and this G tag in SVG terms, G stands for group. This G tag basically just moves everything around a bit. You don't need it, but I just put it there, so it looks nicer. Okay, next, now to the more interesting part, we pass in our data. So the data that I'm using for the second part is the 5.csv link. This link is also included in the notes. And then again, we call the function. D3, you pass in a data object as data, and then we want to see what it looks like. Also, the data. Well, not this side. So if you are using live server, you have to dispose of the old page and then start a new page. If you're calling it directly, just open this HTML and it will work fine for you. So mine basically, here. So it prints out our data here. So you can see that there are 10 rows, and each row has 2 columns. And the columns are country name and some value, maybe income or something. I'm not really sure. Basically, you have one country name and one value. So for a bar chart, what can we do with this? So first, we want to somehow specify the x and y axis. Let's just Google what does a bar chart? See, for a bar chart, the basic elements are an x-axis and a y-axis. And when you start to draw something, the first thing you have to think about is where the elements should be, right? So I know that I will have some rectangles inside my plots. So I would want them to have some rectangles spaced out evenly on the x-axis, and the height of the rectangle will be defined by some value. So that means first we have to define our axis. In D3, the way you define an axis is basically first define a scale. Similar to what we did before for color scale. Recall color scale linear gives you a domain and a range. You put in a value inside the domain and it maps it to the range. The axis is the same thing. But instead of linear on the x-axis, you remember that for bar chart, we want stuff to space out evenly, and each of them has a specific width. Well, they have the same width, but they all have a width. So D3 has a convenient way to do it. It's called D3.scaleBand. And scaleband also takes in a range. And the range goes from 0 to width. Width here is basically the page width, the width of the canvas, I mean. It's the width for this entire element. And so what I'm trying to say is x scale goes from the x-axis goes from the left to the right limit of the canvas. Next, I want to define a domain. So for data, for a bar chart, their domain here is a color. But for data, remember our data has countries, so our domain will be countries. But we don't want to manually assign each value. Fortunately, D3 does that for us. If we just pass in the domain here using a map function, and this map function basically takes in a row and it returns the row's country. This is called a shorthand notation or arrow function. It's the same as you declaring a function called function row return row country. It's the same as this. If you're more comfortable with this syntax, just use that. But I want the code to be shorter, so this is how I do it. So now, what this is doing, it's assigning each of the country we have, and then it gives them their specific range in the data. So it divides the entire width of the canvas into even areas and put the country to those areas. But I want to have some spacing in between, because you look at this next spot, they have some spacing between the columns. And we can do it easily using a method called padding. I'll just pad like a fifth of the width. That's what 0.2 stands for. And for the x-axis, we do the same thing for the y-axis. Scale linear. It's pretty simple. Scale linear is what we did before, right? For the color, we just pass in the domain and the range. So I'm going to cheat here a little bit. From before, we have, because we don't know our domain in this one, so we have to manually find our min and max, and we pass it into the domain. But just because I've looked at this data set before, I know that the min is most likely 0, and the max is around 20,000 something. I'll put 13,000 here because I want the plot to be like slightly above the highest column, just to give some headspace. And our range is height and 0. So this might be confusing. So why is it height and why is it 0 second? Remember that the y-axis goes top down. So we start from height and we go down to 0. That's basically means what we're doing. And now we have to actually append this these axes to the canvas. So I call SVG canvas. Well, actually, I call it SVG and not SVG canvas. Just call the SVG element, and then I'll append a group to it. So a group is G, just like before. It's just a notation. You can call it whatever you want, really, but I would just call it G. First, I wanted to have some transform, and this is a bit tedious. I'm basically passing the location for this axis. Right. So in JS, what I'm doing here is I'm basically using an F string. It's using this not a chord. It's like a slightly tilted chord. It's on the tilde button, and then you can pass in directly a variable called like this. So I'm basically putting this group at x0 and y height. And to create the axis, the function is called call. It will call this function here. It calls the constructor for the axis bottom, and I pass in x, which is the scale. What it's doing is that it's creating an axis bottom using this scale that I've created. So now for that axis object, I want to select the text word. Select all the text. Why am I selecting text? Because, well, on axis, for it to make sense, you need some label for it, right? So we select all the text. We add an attribute to it. I'll just transform it so that it's in a bit of a nice position. Whoops. Again, I've done this before, so I know where everything should be, but if you just do it without, you will see what I mean. That's 45. Yeah. And then I want the anchor to be N. This is all optional, but it's just to format it so it looks nicer. Okay, that's the axis bottom. What about the axis left, which is the y-axis? So we want another group for G. And this one is simpler because we just need to pass in axis and pass in a y scale. So now let's look at what's happening. You can see now D3 did all the math for us. It figure out all the scaling, all the spacing in between, and it puts in our labels for us. You can see that how easy it was. It was basically just these 4 chunks, and it does all the complex math and all the manual labor. Okay, so we want to add our rectangles now, which is our bars. Let's create some bars. Our bars are rectangles, right? But I want to call it bars element, just for fun. You can call it rect or something. I'll call it just bars. And then just like before, now you can start to like do this from memory now. Once you do this enough, every time you do it, just data, enter, and then append the shape. And then my rectangle, where do I want my rectangle? My X position. So my X position, where does it go? I do not know. I kind of have to figure it out myself. But I don't need to, because I've already created the scale band object called X, and that object can do my work for me. So I'll just take in a passive function, go index, and I just return the X object, and I'll pass in my row.country, because the X object knows where that country goes. So now if I look at my elements, there are all these rectangles here. And I don't know if you can see it on the top. They are all on the top, and then they have no height. So no sides. So they're invisible. But you can see that they are spaced evenly throughout the range, which is quite handy. So now we have to do something about the width. The width is the same. X did it for us. And because of this, it's a scale band, you can just call the bandwidth method. And then it will automatically determines the width for you, like how thick the bar should be. And then I wanted to have some color, just fill, and the color would be, let's say, blue. And then what about my Y position? My Y position would be a bit tricky, row and index, because Y starts 0Y starts from the top, right? But on our plot here, Y0 is down here. So it's a bit confusing, but once you get a sense of it, it will start to make sense. But we don't have to worry about it, because just like X, we already defined a scale for it called Y. So if I just return Y, and then row.value, just for demonstration purposes, I just add in some height. I'll just say everything has like a 50 height. Let's see what happens. Okay, it puts everything in this location. Oh, it's value because with a capital V. Okay, it puts everything in their corresponding position, but seems like everything is going downwards. Right? It's going downwards because the y-axis goes downwards. So height also goes downwards. So we have to do some math to fix this, which is not very complex, especially basically just the canvas height. The canvas height minus our current y value. is row row.l. So now everything is drawn nicely, but it's pretty simple. We can add some flair to it. I'll show you how to add an animation to it. So if you look at the old example here. So in the example here, I have all the bars growing from the bottom up. And it's really easy to do. All you need to do is call the D3 transition function. So first I will select all the bars. Remember, select all does what it says, like all the bars. But I want to specifically select the rectangle elements because I'm resizing the rectangles. So I will select all the rectangles. And then our function here is called transition. Transition does all the manual work for us. It basically gets the duration. And then after duration, you add something new behind it. Add new state. What it does, it tries to figure out the current state of the rectangles. And then it will smoothly does whatever you add behind it during the duration. So my new duration, I wanted to have the full height. So I'll just copy this here. This is our final height, right? And then what if we want to start it at 0? So to start it at 0, it's quite simple. It's just the height is basically y of 0. And then for the y position, y position is y of 0. My bad. I confused myself. For the height, we want something like row and then height minus y of 0. Why? Because we want it to be on the axis here, right? And remember this axis here is height minus y of 0. Okay, so now you can see that everything goes upward, but at the same time, you can add something to it to make it a bit fancier. We'll just call it delay. A delay basically, what a delay basically does is it's gonna, in between the elements, it's gonna add a delay in between the elements. And the delay takes in some variables. I'll just call some generic variable like a function with generic variable called dni because we don't want to use it. So let's print it out. Let's see what it is. Let's console.log. And then I'll return something called maybe 100. What this is doing is that for each element at position I, it will start after I minus 100. So before everything starts at 0, right? It starts at the same time. But I want it to start like a bit after each other. So that's why I use the index and I multiply it by 100. So now you can see that the first part grows first, and then after a while, everything goes afterwards. Yep, so that's mostly basically what we have for this bar chart. And you can add more interactivity with it. Remember from before, we add something with mouse over and mouse out. Let's try and see if we can do the same thing here. I'll just copy the code from our previous example. And then instead of select all circle, I want to select all rectangle. Okay, let's see what's going on. SVG can. Oh, my bad. Let's go SVG in this section. Okay. See now, like everything. The good thing about D3 is everything just starts to become a pattern after a while. You can see that everything I do is kind of similar to before, except for like some specific function, but like the patterns remain the same for most of the operations. And then I can even copy basically the code from our random circle plots, and I just copy and paste it here, and it simply just works. Like it's kind of magical in a way that it just works without any errors. We can even add some more fancy stuff to it. Originally, I planned to just add it here, but we have like 8 minutes left. Maybe I'll show you how to add like a pop-up text. So remember before we have a text element. So what we want to do is on mouse, we want to show some text. Okay, so let's just define a random paragraph element. Paragraph is to store a text here, right? So the paragraph is currently here, but I don't want it to be shown. So style is display. Done. Okay, now it's hidden. Now I want to show this element. Maybe I should add an ID to it. Sorted. Now I want to show this element whenever my mouse hovers over it. So what I do is in the mouse over function, I'll just say SVG. Is it? Oh. Okay, I'll put in some div just in case. Because I think the select function is only inside the code scope. I want to svg.select. I want the tooltip element. And then for the tooltip element, I will change the style. Maybe style display is none. I'll change the display style to what is it? I'm not a web dev. I don't remember what the display element is. Display CSS. This always happens when I'm doing CSS. Just call it inline. Let's see if that works. Okay, where is my thing? Oh. Display is not setting. I think attribute doesn't have a display element. What about style? Does that work? Oh, okay, it decides to not cooperate. Let me see how I did it before. You can easily tell that I'm not a front-end person, just from not knowing what my CSS does. Over. Huh. I don't know why like Windows went. 1 second. Oh, I just realized that I'm actually sitting in the dark. Okay, that's fine. We can do it another way. Yeah, if you could figure out how to show and hide it properly, if you're better at front end, but we can still change it like this. So we have our text here. We want it to show something. We want to show some text below HTML. Let's see, D3.js change e-text. Select D. That's what I did. Oh, it's D3 or select. Does that work? Okay, now that changed the text to hello. We want the text to be something meaningful. So we'll get row. So we wanted to have row value. That's right. Undefined. Row dot value. Oh, that's right. Oh, wait, no. Okay. Now when we hover, the text changes accordingly and shows alt text. And then maybe if you can determine how the mouse position is it's defined, then we can do something called mouse move here. On mouse move. And then if I remember correctly, our mouse position will be using event.page x and page y. So I think we can change the .x to event page x, I think. Hopefully that works. No. Well, I think that's our time today though, but that should be enough for everything for you to create a graph. I will include the code for all the examples as well at the end. And if you still wanna work on it, if you're interested in how it works, and if the code doesn't make sense somewhere, just feel free to message me on Discord. I'll be happy to help you out with it. And yeah, hopefully that makes sense to you. If you have any questions. Oh yeah, visibility. Yeah, thanks. I forgot that was the thing. So the select function Yeah, so it's kind of like query selector. Sorry, I've only seen your chat right now, Sid. It's kind of like query selector, but it's using a D3 wrapper around it so that it can, yeah, it basically use D3 functions. Cool beans. So anyone has any questions, just feel free to message me. Or else, I think that's should be it for today. Um, yeah, thanks everyone. Stop sharing screen. Cool beans.